It's a pleasure for me to welcome you here in the name of the Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics. And of course, as we are here in Oxford, the center is in fact connected to the work we are doing here on Islamic ethics. So we had these 3 days. This is the second day of a closed seminar that we had on arts and ethics from an Islamic perspective. And what we tried to do, and we are trying to do, is in fact to come with a methodology where we are putting together scholars of the text and scholars of the context, or scholars who are dealing with the scriptural sources, and having a discussion with practitioners, scholars that have knowledge about arts. And we have 10 fields on which we are working on what we called applied Islamic ethics, contemporary perspective. You have brochures. When you can take them, feel free to take one brochure. I see that some of you took them already. You will find what we are trying to do with the center, and we are trying to work. We had already a seminar on bioethics. Today it's about arts. And our discussion this evening, it's a panel discussion about the ethical limits on arts expression and Islamic perspective. So how can we deal with art? Should we have limits or ethical limits? If yes, how do we think about them? If not, in which way we have to deal with arts in our contemporary world? And this is a discussion that we want to have, which is very important if you see what is happening now. Not, by the way, not only in the Muslim majority countries, but within the Muslim communities and in the discussion with the West. So it's not only a discussion about the relationship between Muslims and Western understanding. It's Muslims thinking about their own references, and to do this, dealing with scholars, dealing with artists that are not Muslims, and dealing with them in a way where we are trying to understand what are the challenges and in which way we can understand the contemporary challenges in this specific field about freedom of expression, artistic freedom, and is there a link between art and ethics? If yes, or if no, it's obvious that from an Islamic perspective, the first understanding is this, yes, but the question is, what are the limits? How do we deal with this from an Islamic perspective? And once again, our methodology is also to gather not only scholars of the text and scholars of the context, but for the context, having scholars that are people of and specialists and scholars of other faiths, Christians, Jews and Buddhists and atheists, people who have an ethical concern and try to come with some answer on this. So our panel this evening will try to tackle this very question, and we have with us, as you know, Zarqa Nawaz, script writer and filmmaker, best known for Little Mosque on the Prairie. You have been, maybe you watched it, coming from Canada, and she will talk about her own experience. Professor Jonas Otterbeck, professor of Islamic Studies at Lund Universities in Sweden, and Professor Jasser Auda, who is the Deputy Director of the Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics in Qatar, and at the same time teaching in the field of Islamic studies, and especially the field of maqasid, the objectives and the higher objectives of the Islamic legislation and the Islamic teaching and understanding. So we will start with 20 minutes each presentation, and then the floor will be open for your questions and your comments just after the presentation. So, Professor Jonas Otterbeck, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. We are, as Professor Ramadan said, in the middle of something. And it's really difficult to just take 15, 20 minutes out of that discussion, but I'll try to focus my mind after sitting a full day of really interesting discussions. But one thing that if we talk on the topic on ethical limits to art expressions, one of the key issues, I think, is to understand what religious ethic is in comparison to a legal system of a country. Is the ethics something that advises about a good life, sinfulness, or are they in fact censorship laws and legal issues? Has the pretension of censoring or setting the framework for artists? Well, as you all probably know, this is very different in different settings, whereas in England, for example, the logic is, of course, that religious Islamic ethics is advising. In other countries, it might be a legal issue, like, for example, in Iran or Saudi Arabia. A second question that is of big importance in this relation is the relationship between scholars and artists. Is it that artists seek the approval of scholars, or is it that scholars seek to advise, criticize, restrict, or even censor artists? That kind of relationship is truly interesting to look at. And if we look at it in the area of music, for example, among artists who create Islamic music, there's a lot of them who seek out Islamic scholars and ask them, can I do this? Is this proper? Is this advisable? Will I push the limits by doing this? Some, of course, couldn't care less and still call themselves Islamic and just push the limits and try out different things. Also, this is different in different contexts. An artist that you probably know, like Sami Yusuf, seeks out the advice of scholars. But an artist like I met for a month ago, who is a professional dancer in Iran, she's actually monitored in her art all the time by people who are restricting and having an agenda of how to move Islamically in an Islamic ballet performed in Iran. So it's very different in different contexts, but it's crucial issues, these about ethics and law, advice or censorship, about the relationship between the artist and the scholar. We haven't really touched upon this yet, but I'm going to bring it on the table tomorrow, see what happens. But anyway, another thing that I find interesting in this is that we have talked a lot about arts, and I think that one of the key issues when we look at art and scholarly work of religion is the difference of language, where the historical language of fiqh, of the jurisprudence, of the Islamic scholar, is a language of intellectualism, of discussion, of careful weighing of different arguments, and trying to find limitations and providing pronounced, clear answers. But the language of art might also seek limitations, might also address issues that are sensitive, but very often avoids providing answers. Rather, trying to formulate an art that sort of evokes questions to find answers. Not all art is like that. For example, you have the art theory of socialist art, for example, says that we have to have art that has an objective, that propels people to work. And actually, the discussion in Islamic settings often centered around the concept van al-hadith, that is sort of purposeful art, speaks a very similar language that you can find in socialist art theory from the 30s, 40s and onwards, that it should be purposeful, it should have a meaning, it should not avoid that issues. So what about the art that seeks answers, or rather seeks to pose questions by balancing on borders, by addressing issues that they know is sensitive, to propose, or rather not propose, but to provoke reactions and answers, that by these provocations might actually push the boundaries of the intellectual language of the jurisprudence. How is that relationship? That's a really interesting thing when we discuss ethical limits of art expressions. Should we actually rather ask artists to push limits? Because it also is beneficial for a general community's understanding of its own limits. I won't go into a discussion about the possibility of postmodern art and postmodern artists or black metal artists or whatever trying to push the limits of moral discussion. But it is an interesting idea to see people who actually, for example, hate religion. How can they contribute to the understanding of religion? But I won't go there. Maybe some of you will ask me more about it. My contribution in this setting is to talk about music and Islam. And I see the question of music and the legality of music when it comes to Islamic theology as a litmus test. For an Islamic scholar, I'm not a Muslim Islamic scholar. I do Islamic studies from sort of secular social science, history of ideas point of view. It becomes a really interesting case because I can study anything. I can study legal history. I can study popular culture. I can study any kind of expression, actually, where Islam becomes relevant. Right now, and you probably have heard some of the artists, there is a wave of Islamic music. There is Islamic hip-hop, there is Islamic rap of different kinds, there is Islamic soft pop, there is Islamic reggae music, actually even Islamic reggae music made in Sweden for some reason. One question that has to be asked all the time is, of course, why Islamic? Is it a market label? Do you sell things by saying this is Islamic? Well, that was actually a wave in Egypt, especially in the 90s, where you sold everything as Islamic. Buy an Islamic farm, okay? Islamic ecological oranges, Islamic watches, Islamic elevators. I particularly like Islamic elevators. You know what an Islamic elevator does? While you go up and down, it recites the Quran for you. Do you know what a Jewish elevator does? It actually is voice controlled during the Sabbath, so you can say, floor 4, please, and it take you up without you having to push the button. Islamic nail polish is another favorite of mine. Do you know what that is? That's simply removable for when you're going to sort of wash yourself before prayer. You can simply remove, it's sort of easily removable, and then you can put it on again. It's like a sticker. That's an Islamic nail polish. So for some reason it exploded with this Islamic as a sort of a adjective. But Islamic music, as I see it, is also something very specific. It's artists trying to, in some way, relate to an Islamic agenda, an Islamic ethics in their art. And this is, of course, especially visible, it's clear in the lyrics. And we have among us here the CEO of Awakening, and for some of you that means something, but maybe you know that sort of Sami Yusuf, Mal Zain, and people like that. And they have pushed the boundaries for conscious Islamic music the last 10 years in a really interesting way, both when it comes to lyrics, when it comes to music, when it comes to visuals, in concert settings, but also in the way that they represent their artists in video clips, for example. So I really find this interesting, and they're also producing this Islamic art in dialogue with scholars. So this new situation of which sometimes slightly call consumer culture Islam is something truly fascinating because it's happening now. It wasn't there 20 years ago. It's there now. And it's not only artists pushing the boundaries and scholars trying to understand and change. There's a tremendous effect by the scholars also when it comes to ethical monitoring. And I can give you a short example and then I'll finish there. The Islamic reggae artist from Sweden that I mentioned is called Mecca, double K. So if you type that when you come home, Mecca reggae Sweden, possibly, you can get, it's pretty decent old school reggae. This guy who does it, his name is Omar. He's also serving as the translator of the khutbah at Fridays in the Uppsala Mosque, which is sort of one of the largest cities in Sweden, where he translates from Arabic into English. And he's also completely convinced that a Salafi line of thought is the correct one. So when I interviewed him, I asked him, but really, Omar, you don't strike me as a Salafi. To start with, you perform like a dancehall artist on stage, and afterwards you struck up conversations with some of the female fans here. So what's the Salafi part of your behavior? And he said to me, no, I don't live a Salafi life, but I think the Salafis are right. Now, this has been something that has been nagging him. And my last contact that I had with him last week, and I asked him, any new gigs down in the park where I live? And he said, no, stop doing that. Okay, I asked him why. Because I finally accepted that making music is wrong. So I've given up that. And by the way, no one has given me a nice fat record contract. So I'll give up now. I stopped doing this. This is haram. So there's a tremendous impact of the reading, and many of the artists, they struggle with this. Some create an understanding that their art is good. Others do that during periods and then think otherwise. Or you can have artists like Yusuf Islam who change their mind a couple of times. But I'll finish there and I'll open for question when Jasser and Zarqa has been given their minutes.
Thank you so much. Very good introduction and some stories that I'm sure we'll have reaction on that. Zarqa, Nawaz, it's your turn and the floor is yours.
I just wanted to. It doesn't work. That's right. Sorry.
It's just to record you.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Am I loud enough? I just wanted to know who here is familiar with the show Little Mosque on the Prairie. So a couple of you have seen it because we're gonna show clips.
Say it again. Say it. Sorry.
Oh, it's a television show called Little Mosque on the Prairie. Have you seen it? No. I have clips from the show, and I'm going to describe it, how it came to be, why I made it, what kind of impact it had in Canada. I'm a journalist by training.
No.
Is it working?
It's working. You tell them when you want them.
Okay. And it'll be there? Okay.
Yeah.
Mesa, what's the first one?
Go sit in the
Called?
audience and watch it.
Oh, the game show. Okay. I keep thinking I should. Oh, you guys are gonna watch it. Have you ever seen it? No. One. Oh, okay. I was the way the show came into being. I started off making short comedic films to see if I had the talent in comedy and then in story writing, and I would get my inspiration from my own community and what was happening in the wider non-Muslim community because I live in Canada. My first professional film was called Death Threat, and it was a comedy based on at that time we had that fatwa of death from Salman Rushdie, then Taslima Nasreen, and it was all in the media about Muslims and the fatwas of death for writers. So I wrote a comedy about a young Muslim author called Yasmin Siddiqui who wanted to get her book published, but she wasn't very good and she couldn't attract a publisher, so she decided on purpose to go get a death threat because it would help her career. Except she couldn't enrage anyone in her Muslim community enough to sign her a death threat. So then she decided to take a shortcut and she wrote her own death threat. And she needed someone authentic to sign it. And it turned out that the Hamas was in town giving a lecture, but only men were invited. So she decided he would be perfect to sign her death threat. So she went to the lecture, wearing niqab and the whole burqa. And when she gets there, she realizes that she had misread the sign, and it wasn't, in fact, a lecture by the Hamas. It was a cooking class for hummus. And so she pretended to deliver his chickpeas, and he signed the death threat thinking it was the delivery for his chickpeas. And then she used it, as her proof that she had got an authentic death threat. So it was a comedy, that was taking the whole issue of death threats and fatwa and writers and publicity and, the whole exotic, example of how Islam is used and demonized in the media. And so that was the type of comedy that I was playing with. And then I made a documentary called Me in the Mosque, just about, women and men and their relationships in the masjids and the whole issue of space. And that's when the idea came to me. What if the imam was born and raised in Canada? These days now we're getting more and more imams born and raised in Canada or, the U.S. But back then there weren't any. They were always from overseas. And I thought, would it change the dynamic of the Muslim community? What would change? Would he have a different feeling towards the young people or women, people who are traditionally in conflict, with sort of the more conservative imams? And so the idea came that Amar was a young lawyer who gave up his law career to run a mosque in the prairies. And so he's trying to make the mosque, a place. The mosque is set in a church. So we have both a Christian community and a Muslim community interacting in this house of worship. And he is trying to create a harmony between the two groups. So in this particular clip, he's decided to have a quiz night. Stories, questions about Islam from the Quran and Hadith, and he's invited all the Muslims in. And, Babar is the one who considers himself the best informed Muslim, the one who should be the imam. He's always in constant conflict with Amar. And for this quiz competition, the priest has asked if he could, Father McGee, Duncan McGee, if he could participate. So this is the clip.
People having fun, learning at the same time.
And Carmatch really drags him out of the woodwork.
Too bad. I am one person short of a full house.
And a full house you shall have. I'm ready to test my Islam IQ.
Are you sure? Because these questions are brutal.
My pleasure. Maybe I'll learn something.
Thanks, Duncan. This is great. People of different faiths together, having fun.
I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for the floor of my car.
Aha. Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Walaikum salam.
Welcome to the first ever Test Your Islam IQ night. Now, remember, the purpose of tonight's contest is to have fun. But most important of all,
Carmatch!
no, learning. But before we begin, I'd like us to test our response devices.
What is with these squeaky toys anyway?
You work with what you got, Bobber.
Trade pet of a crocodile?
Tonight's focus is the prophets, peace be upon them. So, let's get started.
May I say something? I just want to apologize in advance for crushing you all. You have my condolences. Please continue.
Thank you, Bobber.
Do not see it as your failure. It is my triumph at the expense of your failure. Go on.
Okay, first question. Hands on squeakers. What was the name of the prophet to whom the Zabur was revealed by God? Bob.
Dawood, peace be upon him.
The answer was correct. Second question. In a dream, I saw 11 stars and the sun all bowing down to me. Who am I?
The Prophet Joseph, or Yusuf, as you would probably say, peace be upon him. Fast enough for you?
That's right, actually.
Sorry, not really fair. That one's in the Bible, too.
Beginner's luck.
Moving on. Who gave birth despite her advanced years? Reverend?
Sarah was promised a child even though she was too old. However, it could also be Zechariah's wife.
Right again.
Do I get bonus points for that?
In Surah Yusuf, verse 4, what do 7 lean cows represent?
The 7 lean cows represent the 7 years of famine. The fat ones, the years of plenty. Boy, a lot of these Quranic stories are very similar to the ones in the Bible.
No kidding.
That is correct. Who turned back to witness the punishment sent to the city of Sodom? Reverend?
Lot's wife.
Next question. Which mountain range in present-day Turkey? Rev again.
Mount Ararat.
You're on a roll.
So that was a story about how the similarities between the two faiths were supposed to bring the communities together, but in fact, Barber got more and more irritated, and as it continues, he wants a rematch because he wants to prove that Islam is, you know, the better religion, but he can't do it because the answers from the Christian priests keep trumping him. So that was one example of a show that we did. Another example was when Eid al-Adha was on December 21st, and Christmas was December 25th. And we were thinking as a group, what kind of story could we do when both Eid and Christmas are almost on the same day, and they share the same building? What kind of conflict would be funny? And so one of the writers said, what if they had trouble with parking? Because on that day, you know, on the few days before Eid, on a few days before Christmas, the Christians also had a play that they wanted to do, so they needed the parking, and the Muslims had their issue. So in this episode, we show the two groups coming together and having a conflict over space.
I can wait no longer. I still have to get my bag of props.
Well, who's gonna valet?
You don't need a valet. The church lot is empty.
Empty.
What happened to Ring Ding a Sing Along?
Hey, you said it right.
Law of averages. So, what happened?
I did the same thing in '98. Scheduled it opposite Slappy the elf with the eye patch.
It's a good holiday special.
Yeah.
Well, you want to come over to our place, have some food?
Thanks. By the way, that honey you gave me was terrible.
Your dad's running a little late. Is there any version of this you can do alone?
Yeah, can you turn off the smoke machine?
Who knows? I mean, you gotta be 16 to drive a car, but the smoke machine's completely unregulated. Are you still here?
Smells like nothing.
There is no food.
Oh, I see. It's an Islamic thing where you celebrate sacrifice by having a dinner without any food. It's beautiful.
No, we were supposed to have food. We just screwed up.
I was gonna say it sounds stupid.
Why is there no food?
You want food? Well, I have Joan and Alice packing up the food from Ring Ding Sing Along right now.
What's ring ding?
Don't.
Now I've been happy lately, thinking about the good things to come. And I believe it could be something good has begun. Oh, I've been smiling lately, dreaming about the world as one. And I believe it could be someday it's going to come. 'Cause out on the edge of darkness, there rides a peace train. Oh, peace train, take this country, come take me home again.
A kind, forgiving, charitable season. The only time in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And so I say, God bless it.
Thank you, Layla. That was lovely. Well, you are here. Everyone, we have time for one final guest before it ends.
Oh, I should have mentioned, so there was a Christmas concert in this show, and Babar, being a very strict, Muslim, told his daughter she could not participate. And she got very upset. And then Babur said, we could do a play about Prophet Ibrahim and the story of the sacrifice of Ishmael in your Christmas play. And so the principal agrees, because he doesn't believe in portraying the prophet or any, of the people of the book, he decides that it'll be people who have overheard the story of Prophet Ibrahim. And so he wears the beard and he dresses up as, a person who has overheard the story. But he had to wear the red jacket because he was valeting the cars for the church lot. So by the time he gets there, he's wearing the red jacket and he's wearing his costume to do the story, of the overheard story of Prophet Ibrahim. But then he gets mistaken as Santa Claus. So this was the comedy of Babur's, that every time he tries to get away from Christian culture, he ends up making the mistake and becoming closer to it by his errors. So that's why all the children rushed towards him, because they mistook his character. He was trying to look like an old person from the time of Prophet Ibrahim. So that was the comedy in that. And the third clip is going to be the controversy of women dancing in Islam. It came up, we were dealing with this issue where they were having a talent show, and Sarah was going to dance. She's the wife of one of the Muslim men. And Babur felt it was un-Islamic for a woman to be displaying her body in such a manner. It's forbidden in Islam. Therefore, they can't go. And Layla is very upset. She finds a cassette tape of Babur dancing Bhangra, because he's Punjabi, at a wedding. And she's like, so you can dance at this wedding in this manner with all these women twirling around you, and you can't let Sarah, you were not allowed to see Sarah. And so Babur finally relents and says, fine, you will see, how right I am. So this is the episode that we did.
It's bad enough you don't want Miss Samudi dancing. When you lie and say she isn't good, it is so much worse.
All right, that is it. You accuse me, your father, of lying? Well, you leave me no choice. We are going to the show.
What?
You will see I'm telling the truth.
You're gonna watch the forbidden dance.
No, you are. Me, I'll be covering my eyes in horror. Prepare yourself.
Here I am. Hey, you just made it. Yes, I'm sorry. I was measuring liquids. The exact amount of lens fluid allowable. It's done.
So you've packed the perfect bag?
The immaculate suitcase. It belongs in an aviation museum.
It's a shame you'll have to open it.
Yeah.
Our next talented performer is Sarah Hamoudi.
Really good, but she was so terrible before.
Well, maybe you raised her confidence and she believed in herself.
And she's been practicing all week.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
She's terrific. Oh, I'm offended. Oh. She's really very good.
You're a good dancer too, Dad.
So ultimately, this show ran for about 6 seasons with 91 episodes, and so we cycled through all the dilemmas that exist in the Muslim community when it comes to women and modesty and relationships with non-Muslims. I mean, we picked all those subjects that we have so much issue with in our communities, and then we had the community debate them and decide how to solve them as a community through comedy and issues. And it ended up becoming the show where it was both sort of an educational moment for both Muslims and non-Muslims, sort of teaching each other about each other, and became one of the most popular shows in Canada, and ended up reviving the whole industry, the whole television industry in the country, because prior to the show, nobody believed sitcoms were possible to be made in Canada, because we compete against the Americans for their shows, and they have the millions and millions of dollars of advertising. So Canadians generally just watch American shows. And then this show comes out of nowhere, and it's about the Muslim community, and it becomes the most unlikely hit anyone ever predicted. I don't think the CBC saw this coming as their monster hit in television. So it was quite amazing. Part of it, I think, the success was everyone didn't know what to expect. Like everyone thought, Muslims didn't know how to handle comedy, couldn't laugh at themselves, and then to do a comedy, we didn't even start off with a family-based comedy with, like the traditional couch in the living room. We started off with a mosque-based comedy in the Muslim community with an imam. So there were like no baby steps to prepare anybody for this sort of concept. So it was quite a shock for everyone. Especially the Muslim community who wasn't sure what to expect. But I think as the years went by and people realized that it was just a show like any other show. And the most interesting thing I heard from non-Muslims was when they watched the show, they felt they could relate to all the characters, which surprised me because I felt like, people in the mosque are unique and unlike anybody else on earth. And they would tell me, no, in our church or our temple, our synagogue, we have these same exact archetypes. They remind me of the people that I go to my house of worship with. And it reminded all of us that ultimately we were the same. So that was the surprising thing that came to me from making the show, was that I was exposing, what I thought were the strangeness of Islam and Muslims. And in fact, I was just reflecting people's own communities back at them. And it just happened to be in a mosque. So anyway, that's an introduction to the show, and I believe my time is up.
Thank you, Zarqa. Thank you so much for that. And I think that this is an example of something which was done in Canada, and not from an Islamic perspective, but talking about Muslims and presenting Muslims. And this is also something that has to do with our discussion. Professor Jasser, Auda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Tariq. I'm not sure I'll be as entertaining as Zarqa and what she's showing, since I'm going to talk about the Islamic perspective. I do prefer to call it an Islamic perspective, though, rather than the Islamic perspective, just an opinion that is informed, I guess, by this seminar, by what we're trying to do in the center, to bring the Islamic ethics to the reality of the people and see how we can propose an Islamic ethical framework for human behavior and human activity. And the Islamic ethical framework does not mean fatwa, by the way. I'm not going to give any fatwa on the Mona Lisa having to wear hijab. This is not what I am trying to do here. In fact, we put this picture there for opening that point. What is the Islamic framework? Does this seriously mean that we're going to put hijabs on women in pictures and so forth? Or the Islamic framework is something that has to do with ethics? And what does Islamic ethics have to do with the reality, the real shows, something like what Zarqa created, and I enjoyed watching, was waiting for as it was airing. The Islamic framework is not just for, in fact, the Islamic gigs and the Islamic rap and the Islamic music, but we have a lot of Islamic out there, especially in the Middle East. We're talking about the Islamic State now in Egypt and Tunisia, and that's for the first time, because now we're trying to imagine an Islamic state, Islamic banking and Islamic finance and Islamic economics that we're also trying to imagine. And I'm not saying that there is no Islamic economics or Islam, but what is it exactly? And is what we have in terms of the Islamic, all of this, is Islamic really? How can we judge that? If I focus on the Islamic art in that sense, I would say that an Islamic perspective that I find very useful is that we should not deal with Islamic art. I don't think we should put the label Islamic onto anything from my perspective, from the state to food to a bank. But I think we could have Islamic food, but we approach it from the Islamic ethics. We can have food, but we approach it from the Islamic ethics point of view. We can have a bank, but we approach it from the Islamic ethics point of view. We can have football instead of calling it an Islamic football, as some of the people in the student unions in some Egyptian universities had proposed, and they had this Islamic football tournament. We could have football, but perhaps we can approach it from an ethical point of view. And if we're talking about Islam, then from an Islamic ethics point of view. The question now is what is Islamic ethics and how can we do that? And the important question that Professor Jonas talked about, which is the relationship between ethics and law, jurisprudence, fiqh and akhlaq. What is the relationship between the ethics and the law in Islam? The answer is quite complicated. I wouldn't propose a final answer, but I have some ideas there that the Islamic ethics point of view on arts comes in two dimensions, the dimension of values and the dimension of rules. I would say that the default way of dealing with arts is the way of values. And in order to be Islamic about arts or about anything else, we have to approach that thing as it is from an Islamic values point of view. The values that are related to arts are values that artists would tell you about, the values of honesty, the values of integrity, the value of beauty, the value of creativity, and all of these values that perhaps all artists share. And that would be one important dimension of the Islamic approach to art, from my perspective. Yet the other dimension, which is the dimension of rules, I prefer to approach it in a case-by-case study, a case-by-case approach. To me, as a person who works with the Islamic law and the Islamic jurisprudence is a case-by-case jurisprudence. It's not something that you put in the law as in the canon, because there is a difference between fiqh, which is the Islamic law, and the qanun, or the canon, or the legal system. The legal system, of course, will have to apply to everybody. But when we talk about the Islamic law in terms of fiqh, it is something that is always catching up with the reality of the people, by definition. It is not supposed to create that reality. It's not one of the objectives of fiqh. And therefore, the artist is free to create and to imagine and to do art. And then if there is a question that comes up from that art, then comes the role of fiqh, comes the role of the Islamic law. The Islamic jurist would be asked about a specific question. And the answer of any question, or what they call fatwa, or what we call fatwa in the Islamic law, is something that differs, we say, between time and a different time, and a person and a different person, and a place and a different place, and an intent and a different intent, and circumstances, or what we call customs or traditions, or the context and a different context. So based on the context, we could have a different rule for something that is very similar. So we have the same scene, but the context, the cultural context, the context of place or time would make a different reaction in terms of the rules. You could have something that the artist would feel reflects his or her own values and her own beliefs from the artist's convictions about what the rules are and about how the artist imagines what is fundamental in Islam and what is peripheral in Islam. So I think that the approach to art, and I would propose, like very roughly, the approach to economics, the approach to the media, the approach to any of these human activities should be a value-based approach based on the Islamic values, initially, based on the internal rules and the internal dynamics and the internal right and wrong of each of these activities, and within art, each kind of art, and the internal rules that define what is right and what is wrong in these kinds of arts. But then fiqh comes after. The Islamic law, the Islamic rules comes if there is a case in which the values would be compromised on one level or the other. For those who are interested in values, or those who study the Islamic values, or even ethical values in general, you know that values contradict sometimes. The value of creativity and the value of beneficence, for example, the value of chastity and the value of honesty or truthfulness in showing something. And therefore, perhaps the Islamic proposal would be a proposal that is mostly silent about the details, very vocal about the values that the artist should observe, but then the details would differ in terms of dealing with them between places and times and circumstances and the context, really. Hence, as Dr. Tariq always writes and talks about the integration between the text and the context in that sense. And that is what we are trying to do in the Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics by bringing the scholars of the text and the scholars of the context. Some of them are here, and the scholars of the context, Zarqa and Jonas being from that group, and trying to come up with an Islamic perspective on arts in our particular case. So again, I told you that this is not going to be as entertaining as Zarqa's, but I hope I, threw some ideas at you that would be good for discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think we have three perspectives. One is about the framework, another one about an experience as the movie and coming from the movie experiment, and the third one is what we are trying to do from within the Islamic frame of reference and trying to conceptualize and to come with something which could be an applied Islamic ethics. Also the mindset is exactly this, is building the haram and then having limits to on which, and the other question that I think it's critical in our understanding, which was coming, she left, but this is the meaning of what is Islamic in the values that we are talking about, and this comes with the definition of art, because it's not only a question of values, speaking about freedom and honesty and all this. I think that this is important, but in fact there is something which has to do, and I will give you an example. It has to do with reconciliation. Is in fact, when you speak about art, you speak about the concept of human being. What puts you and reconcile yourself with your own self? How do you reconcile? And I remember once that Prince Charles here in Oxford said, what is very important in the Islamic tradition when it comes to environment is that environment is at the center of the Islamic conception of the relationship between human being and environment. It has to do with reconciling the whole thing. This is the creation. And it might be that what we call art from an Islamic perspective would be in which way, when you deal with elevation and imagination, this is reconciling yourself with what you have. Salamat in-nafs, which is peace with your own self. And it's deeper than values. It's what is behind and before the values themselves. It could be. But I think that asking the question is not wrong. It might be that we might sometimes have the wrong answer. Thank you. You can just help yourself with the brochures, and you can follow the work that we are trying to do on our website, cilecenter.org. And I think that we are working on many fields. You have them in the brochure. Thank you for coming, and have a good evening.